The first ship appeared over the moon on a quiet Tuesday morning, and nobody on Earth believed it at first. It was not a single ship, it was a fleet, and it dropped out of the black sky like a swarm of dark seeds, spreading wide until it covered the near side of the moon in a net of metal. Telescopes on Earth picked up the shapes within minutes. News channels went silent, then loud, then silent again as people tried to understand what they were looking at. Governments woke their leaders in the middle of the night. Soldiers were called to bases they did not know existed. And far above all of them, on the gray dust of the moon, something ancient and hungry had come to stay. The aliens called themselves the Vothrak, though humans would not learn that name for weeks. Their ships were long and curved, black as coal, with lines of dull red light running along their hulls, like veins under skin. They did not send a message, they did not ask for anything, they simply began to land, one ship after another, sinking into the deep craters on the moon's surface, as if they had done this 1,000 times before, on 1,000 other worlds. General Elena Cho stood in the command center beneath Colorado, watching the feed from the lunar observatory. She was 52 years old, with gray at her temples, and a face that had learned long ago not to show fear in front of subordinates. But even she felt her stomach tighten as more ships appeared on the screen, blooming out of empty space like flowers of iron. "How many?" she asked, though she was afraid of the answer. 200 confirmed, said the young officer at the console. His voice cracked slightly. "Maybe more. Some are hiding behind the far side. We can't get a clean count." "And no communication?" "None, ma'am. They're not responding to any signal. Radio, laser, nothing. It's like we're not even here." Cho folded her arms and studied the images. The ships did not look rushed. They did not look like an army preparing to strike. They looked patient, almost lazy, the way a predator moves when it already knows it has won. That patience frightened her more than any weapon could have. Word spread across the world in hours. By the next morning, every television screen, every phone, every wall of glowing pixels showed the same thing. Dark ships crawling over the surface of the moon, settling into its craters like beetles, burrowing into old wood. Some people wept, some people prayed. Some people simply stood outside their homes and stared up at the pale disk in the sky, trying to see with their own eyes what the cameras had already shown them. In an underground base outside of Reno, Nevada, a much smaller and much older group of people were not staring at the sky at all. They were staring at each other. Admiral James Okafor sat at the head of a long steel table, deep beneath a mountain that most maps did not even bother to name. The room was full of gray-haired engineers, quiet-eyed scientists, and a handful of officers who had spent their entire careers pretending they worked a boring desk job in the Pentagon. On the wall behind Okafor hung a faded photograph of the moon, with small red circles marking a dozen craters. Tycho, Copernicus, Aristarchus, places that, to the rest of the world, were just names on old maps. "They landed on top of us," said one of the engineers, a woman named Dr. Priya Nasser, her voice tight. "Almost every ship, every single one, came down near one of our sites." "Coincidence?" asked a younger officer. "No," Okafor said quietly. "It's not coincidence. It means they scanned deep, deeper than we thought anyone could. They found the shafts." The room went silent. For 60 years, since the earliest days after the Second Cold War had cooled into an uneasy peace, a secret program had been growing under the surface of the moon. It had no single name that the public would ever recognize. Those inside called it, simply, the Deep Yard. It had begun as a modest idea. If humanity was ever attacked from space, Earth itself would be the worst place to build a defense. Every rocket, every base, every shipyard on Earth's surface could be seen, tracked, and destroyed. But the moon was different. The moon was covered in craters older than dinosaurs, deep bowls of rock that no nation on Earth had ever fully mapped from below. And under those craters, over decades, hollowed out by robotic drills that worked in silence and dark, humanity had built something it hoped it would never need to use. Shipyards. Hidden fleets. Weapons designed not by one country, but by nearly every country on Earth, working together in the deepest kind of secrecy, funded through budgets that were never questioned, staffed by people who vanished from public life and never came back to talk about their work. It had taken 3 generations to build. It had cost more money than any nation would admit. And for 60 years, it had sat there, waiting, hoping it would never be needed. Now, alien ships sat directly on top of it. Do they know? Nasser asked. Do they know what's under their feet? We don't know what they know, Okafor said. But we have to assume the worst. We have to assume they see everything we can see, and more. A retired general named Marcus Webb, silver-haired and heavy-shouldered, leaned forward. He had been one of the first engineers on the Deep Yard project, 40 years ago, when it was nothing but a hole in the ground and a dream. Then we wait, he said. We wait, and we watch, and we do not move first. If they don't know what's below them, we don't tell them by panicking. And if they attack Earth while we wait, the young officer asked. Webb's eyes were hard. Then we stop waiting. Above them, unseen, the Volthrak continued their slow, patient work. Their scanning drones spread out across the lunar surface like a spider's web, sniffing at the dust, the rock, the strange metal echoes that came back faint and distorted from deep below the craters. Something down there confused their sensors, some kind of shielding they had never encountered before. Layers of rock and alloy designed generations ago by human minds who had studied every alien contact report, every science fiction warning, every worst-case scenario humanity could imagine. The shields were not perfect, but they were good enough to turn a clear signal into noise. Aboard the Vothrak flagship, a massive vessel called the Aching Tooth in their own tongue, Fleet Commander Scarn Vale studied the readings with growing unease. He was old for his kind, his gray skin marked with the ritual scars of 40 conquests. His 4 eyes narrowed as he stared at the strange shadows deep beneath the crater floor. Report, he said, his voice a low rasp, translated by the ship's systems into something like Earth speech, though no human would hear it for weeks yet. Anomalous density readings, Commander, said his scanning officer, a smaller Vothrak named Reth. Beneath 12 of our landing sites. Possibly natural rock formations, possibly something else. Something else, Scarn repeated. He did not like uncertainty. In 40 conquests, across 40 worlds, he had never needed to like uncertainty, because the species of those worlds had always been so far behind the Vothrak in strength that surprises were rare. Small, wet, fragile creatures who built cities of glass and steel on the surface of their planets, easy to see, easy to break. This world, this blue and green marble spinning below the moon, looked no different. Its cities were bright and open. Its weapons, as far as his scouts could tell, were crude explosives and slow rockets, nothing that could threaten a Vothrak warship. But the shadows beneath the craters bothered him. A good conqueror listened to what bothered him. Increase the scan depth, he ordered, and prepare a probe. If there is something buried in this rock, I want to know what it is before we move forward. Move forward with what, Commander? Reth asked. Scarn's 4 eyes turned toward the blue planet on the view screen, so full of life, so unaware of how thin the line was between peace and slaughter. With the harvest, he said simply. This world is fertile. Its people are many. There is much here worth taking. We will begin as we always begin, with fear. 2 days later, the fear began. It started with 3 cities. Los Angeles, Mumbai, and Cairo each received, within the same hour, a burning line of light that fell from the moon and struck open ground just outside their edges. Not enough to destroy the cities themselves, but enough to leave craters the size of stadiums, throwing up dust clouds that could be seen from space. No warning, no message, just fire, falling from the sky like judgment, and then silence again. The message was clear enough without words. We can do this to your cities whenever we choose. Kneel or burn. Panic swept across the planet in ways that no war in human history had ever caused. Stock markets collapsed within hours. Airports shut down as governments scrambled to decide whether flight itself was now a danger. Streets that had been full of ordinary morning traffic emptied as people rushed home, rushed to family, rushed to churches and mosques and temples, and anywhere that offered the illusion of safety. On every screen, the same images played over and over, the burning line falling, the crater rising, dust curling into the sky like a wound opening in the Earth's skin. In the underground command center beneath Colorado, General Cho watched the reports come in with a face like stone, though inside she felt something cold and heavy settle into her chest. This was no longer a mystery in the sky. This was war, and it had already begun to hurt. She picked up a secure line and dialed a number that very few people in the world even knew existed. Admiral Okafor answered on the second ring. Cho, you saw it. I saw it. They're not asking us anything, Cho said. They're not even threatening us with words. They're just showing us what they can do. There was a long pause on the line. When Okafor spoke again, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Elena, I need you to trust me on something, and I need you to not ask questions, at least not yet. James, 3 cities just got hit. I know, and I promise you, we are not going to let them hit a 4th one without answering, but what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this call. Not to the president, not to the Joint Chiefs, not yet. Cho's grip tightened on the phone. Talk. We have ships, Okafor said. On the moon, under the craters. We have had them for decades. For a long moment, Cho said nothing at all. Outside her office, through the thick glass wall, she could see the operations floor below. Dozens of officers moving between screens, showing burning craters and rising smoke on a planet that had never fully believed, until this week, that it was truly alone in a dangerous universe. How many ships? She finally asked. Enough, Okafor said. Enough to make them regret ever landing where they did. Above them both, in the dark and dust of the lunar surface, Vothrak engineers continued their slow, careful drilling, probing at the mystery beneath their boots, never imagining that the ground itself was about to answer them with fire of its own. Fleet Commander Scarnvale watched his scanning reports scroll past on his private display, his 4 eyes narrowing further with each passing hour, as the anomalies beneath the craters grew clearer, sharper, more impossible to dismiss as mere rock. Something vast slept beneath the moon's broken skin. And soon, it would wake up. For now, though, the people of Earth only knew fear. They knew burning cities and silent skies, and the terrible feeling of being small, in a universe that had just proven itself far larger and far crueler than anyone had wanted to believe. They did not know about the Deep Yard. They did not know about 60 years of quiet, desperate work, or about the thousands of engineers and soldiers who had given their entire lives to a project most of them would never live to see used. They only knew that the moon, which had hung over every human life since the first ape looked up from the grass, had become something dark and dangerous, a hunter's perch, instead of a quiet companion in the night sky. But 384,000 kilometers away, in tunnels bored through billion-year-old rock, alarms had begun to sound. Lights that had been dim for decades flared bright red. Doors that had not opened in years groaned apart on ancient hinges. And deep in the dark, machines that had waited a lifetime for this exact moment began, slowly and surely, to wake up. The Deep Yard was coming online, and nothing the Vothrak had ever conquered had prepared them for what humanity had built in the dark, waiting, patient, for exactly this day. Deep beneath Tycho Crater, in a cavern carved out of solid rock over 40 years by machines that never slept, Chief Engineer Talia Reyes stood on a metal walkway and looked down at something few living humans had ever seen with their own eyes. The ship was called the Endeavor, and it was the size of a small city. Its hull was matte black, absorbing the weak emergency lighting instead of reflecting it, so that the great vessel seemed to sit in the dark like a held breath. Cables as thick as tree trunks ran from the cavern walls into its sides. Scaffolding wrapped around it in a metal cocoon, though most of that scaffolding was already falling away, retracting into hidden slots in the rock as the ship's systems came alive one by one. Talia had spent 19 years of her life in this cavern. She had been a young engineer when she arrived, barely finished with her doctorate, sworn to secrecy by people so serious that she had genuinely believed, for the first 2 years, that she might be shot if she ever spoke a word of her work to anyone outside the project. She had watched her hair go gray under artificial light. She had missed her mother's funeral because the project could not spare her for the 3 days it would take to reach Earth and back. She had given this ship almost 2 decades of her life, and until 3 days ago, she had begun to believe she would give it her whole life, and it would never once leave this cave. Now alarms rang through the tunnels, and the ship beneath her was waking up. "Power core at 60%, called a technician from below, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and something close to joy. 65. 70. "Keep it steady," Talia called back. "We are not rushing a 40-year-old reactor because we're scared. Slow and steady, just like every drill." But her hands, gripping the rail of the walkway, were not steady at all. 3 days earlier, When the first Vothrak ships had appeared over the moon, the Deep Yard had gone into a state its founders had called Silent Watch. Every system had been ordered into deep hibernation, every scan blocked, every heat signature buried beneath decades of insulating rock and alloy shielding. The idea had always been simple. If the Deep Yard ever needed to hide from something in the sky, it would become nothing more than another dead crater, indistinguishable from 10,000 others across the moon's cratered face. That plan had worked, mostly. The Vothrak scans had picked up strange shadows, odd density readings, but nothing they could clearly identify. For 3 days, humanity's secret fleet had sat in silence, directly beneath the boots of an alien invasion force, hoping the aliens would move on, hoping the mystery beneath their feet would seem too small, too strange, too much trouble to investigate. Then the burning lines fell on Los Angeles, Mumbai, and Cairo, and Silent Watch ended. Admiral Okafor's order had come through the deepest, most secure channel the Deep Yard possessed, a message so old in its protocol that some of the younger engineers had needed help decoding it. The message was short. Wake the fleet. Prepare for combat. God help us all. Now, in cavern after cavern, beneath a dozen craters across the moon's surface, 40 years of patient work was finally becoming real. 26 ships in total, built in secret by nations that had once been rivals and had somehow, through decades of quiet cooperation, become something like brothers in a shared and desperate hope. Battleships longer than aircraft carriers, their hulls layered with alloys mined from asteroids that had never been recorded in any public database. Their weapon systems designed by physicists who had spent their careers pretending to work on unrelated, boring research. Fighters small and quick, meant to swarm and confuse larger enemy vessels. Support ships built to repair, to resupply, to keep the fleet fighting long after any normal navy would have been forced to retreat. It was not a fleet built to fight a war of conquest. It had never been meant to attack anyone. It had been built for exactly one purpose: to defend Earth from something exactly like the Vothrak, should that day ever come. That day had come. In the command cavern beneath Copernicus Crater, the largest of the hidden shipyards, Admiral James Okafor stood before a wall of screens, showing the status of every ship in the fleet. Around him, officers who had trained for this exact moment for their entire careers moved with the calm, practiced efficiency of people who had run this same drill 1,000 times in simulation, and had never truly believed they would run it for real. Fleet status, Okafor said. 22 ships at combat readiness, reported Colonel Aisha Bello, the fleet's chief tactical officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that never wavered. 4 more will be ready within 6 hours. All crews report full readiness, weapon systems green across the board. And the Vothrak? Still scanning, sir. Still drilling test probes into the crater floors. They know something is here. They don't know what. Okafor studied the tactical map, a great glowing sphere in the center of the room showing the moon, its craters marked in gold where the hidden shipyards lay, and the black shapes of 200 Vothrak vessels scattered across the surface like a plague of insects. 26 ships against 200. The math was not good, but the Deep Yard had never been designed to fight a fair fight. It had been designed to fight a fight it could win, despite the odds, using surprise, position, and weapons that no one outside this project had ever seen in action. "What's the play, Admiral?" Bello asked quietly. Okafor was silent for a long moment, staring at the glowing map. Somewhere out there, past the golden shipyard markers and the black alien shapes, a blue and green planet held 9 billion people who had no idea their fate was being decided in a cave they had never known existed. "We do not attack first," he finally said. "Not yet. Every fleet has weaknesses it does not know about until it fights. We let them dig. We let them probe. We let them believe, for a little longer, that whatever is under these craters is small and harmless. And when they finally break through, when they finally understand what's beneath their feet, we will be ready, and they will not. And if they attack Earth again before that?" Okafor's jaw tightened. "Then we stop waiting. No more cities burn while we sit in the dark deciding whether to be brave." High above the moon's surface, Fleet Commander Scarn Vale received the latest scanning reports with a growing, gnawing frustration that he had not felt in decades. In 40 conquests, he had never encountered a world that hid so much beneath so little. The species below, these humans, as his translators had begun calling them, based on the crude radio chatter his ships intercepted. Should have been simple. Their cities were bright and undefended. Their military ships, the ones openly flying above their own planet, were laughably weak, built for a war against each other rather than against the stars. And yet something beneath the moon's craters kept returning readings that made no sense. Dense metal shadows, faint energy signatures that flickered and vanished like ghosts, structures that seemed to be growing warmer by the hour, as if something down there were slowly, deliberately, waking up. "Send the drilling probe deeper," Skarn ordered. "I want visual confirmation of what lies beneath Tycho before we proceed with the second wave of strikes on their cities." "Yes, Commander," Reth answered, though something in his voice carried a note of unease. "Commander, if I may, the drilling probe at Copernicus Crater has stopped transmitting." Skarn's 4 eyes turned sharply toward his scanning officer. "Stopped how?" "Signal loss. Total. 11 minutes ago." "Malfunction?" "Unknown, Commander. We have never lost a probe this way before. Not to malfunction. Not to any world we have conquered." Skarn was silent for a long moment, his ancient, scarred face, unreadable, even to those who had served under him for years. 40 conquests had taught him many things, but the lesson that mattered most in this moment was simple. The universe was full of surprises, and the conquerors who survived long enough to become legends were the ones who respected those surprises instead of dismissing them. "Pull back the second wave," he said finally. "No further strikes on the cities until we understand what lies beneath this moon." "Commander, the Council expects results. They authorized this campaign expecting a swift harvest, not delays over—" "The Council is not here," Skarn snapped, his rasping voice sharp enough to silence Reth immediately. "I am here, and I did not survive 40 conquests by ignoring my instincts when something feels wrong. Something is wrong here. I intend to find out what, before we lose a single ship to a mistake that could have been avoided." Far below, in the tunnels beneath Copernicus Crater, the missing Vothrak drilling probe lay in pieces on a metal examination table, surrounded by a team of very excited, very exhausted human engineers who had captured it, disabled it, and torn it open within minutes of its unwelcome arrival in their ceiling. "It's beautiful work," muttered Dr. Priya Nasser, turning a small component over in her gloved hands, her eyes wide behind her protective goggles. "Alloy composition unlike anything in our databases. Sensor arrays at least 2 generations ahead of our best equipment. Whoever built this understood things about material science we haven't even theorized yet." "Anything we can use?" Okafor asked, standing at the edge of the room with his arms crossed. "Oh, absolutely," Nasser said, a fierce grin spreading across her tired face. "Give my team 48 hours, and we'll have countermeasures built into every scanner on the fleet. But that's not the important thing, Admiral." "What's the important thing?" Nasser held up the probe's core processing unit, a small crystal lattice pulsing faintly with residual energy. This thing was recording everything it saw, video, scans, everything, right up until we shut it down, which means somewhere in that alien fleet, someone is about to review this footage and see exactly what we look like. Okafor's expression darkened. "How much did it capture?" "Enough," Nasser said quietly. "Enough for them to know these are real ships, Admiral. Real, big, powerful ships. The element of total surprise. It might already be gone." Okafor closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 40 years of secrecy beginning to crack. He thought of Marcus Webb, the old general who had begun this project 4 decades ago in a hole in the ground with nothing but hope and stubbornness. He thought of every engineer, every soldier, every family that had sacrificed something quiet and unspoken to keep this fleet hidden until the day it was needed. That day was here, and now, perhaps, their greatest advantage, surprise, was slipping away before the battle had even truly begun. "Get the fleet to full combat readiness," he said, opening his eyes. "All 26 ships, now. If they know what we are, we cannot afford to wait for the perfect moment anymore. We may only have the moment we're given." Above, Skarn Vale stared at the recovered footage his engineers had pieced together from the probe's final transmitted fragments before signal loss. Grainy, incomplete, but unmistakable. Massive hulls, black as the space between stars, humming with power in caverns carved by unimaginable patience. Weapons ports the size of his own flagship's main cannon, Dozens of vessels, and the readings suggested dozens more still hidden, still waiting, still unaccounted for. For the first time in 40 conquests, Fleet Commander Scarn Vale felt something he had not felt since he was a young soldier on his very first campaign, centuries ago, staring up at a sky he did not yet understand. He felt afraid. "Sound the alert," he ordered, his rasping voice suddenly urgent in a way his crew had never heard before. "All ships, prepare for combat. Whatever is beneath these craters, it is not harmless, and it is not small. We have made a grave mistake landing where we did." But the order came too late. Beneath Copernicus crater, deep in the golden-marked heart of the deep yard, Admiral Okafor stood before his assembled fleet commanders, one final time, 26 ships worth of captains and crews, watching him through screens that connected every vessel in the shipyard into a single, unified voice. "For 60 years, Okafor said, his voice carrying through every cavern, every ship, every headset, this fleet was built for a single purpose, not conquest, not glory, defense. Today, that purpose is finally real. The people up there," he gestured upward, toward the rock ceiling and the vacuum beyond it, toward the blue and green planet spinning far below, "do not know we exist. They do not know what has been built here, in the dark, for their sake. They only know fear, and fire falling from their own moon." He paused, looking out at the faces on his screens, young officers and old veterans, engineers turned soldiers, scientists turned warriors, every one of them a product of a project that had asked its people to give up decades of their lives for a moment that might have never come. "That moment is now," Okafor said. "Prepare to open the crater doors. Prepare to bring our ships into the light. Today, the people of Earth are going to learn that they were never as alone, or as helpless, as they believed." Across a dozen craters on the moon's ancient, battered surface, massive doors that had been sealed and hidden for decades began, for the very first time, to grind slowly open, and the Vothrak fleet, still reeling from the discovery of what lay beneath their feet, was about to find out exactly how wrong they had been. The crater floor of Copernicus split open like the shell of an egg. For 60 years, the surface above the deep yard had been disguised as nothing more than broken lunar rock, a jumble of boulders and dust, indistinguishable from 1,000 other craters scattered across the moon's ancient face. Now that disguise fell away in an instant. Massive plates of camouflaged stone, each one weighing more than a battleship on its own, slid apart on hidden rails, and from the darkness beneath, the first true warship of the Earth Defense Fleet rose into the vacuum. Its name was the Endeavor, the very ship Talia Reyes had spent 19 years of her life building, and as it lifted clear of the crater's broken lip, sunlight struck its matte black hull for the very first time in its existence. It was 3 kilometers long, a spear of dark metal bristling with weapon ports along every surface, its engines glowing a deep, steady blue as it climbed away from the moon's gray dust. Behind it came the Resolute, then the Vigilant, then ship after ship, rising from craters across the lunar surface like a fleet of ghosts, finally allowed to become real. 22 vessels total, with 4 more still completing their final power-up sequences deep below. Small fighters spilled out around the larger ships like sparks thrown from a fire, hundreds of them, quick and nimble, forming into defensive screens around their larger cousins with the practiced precision of decades of simulated drills finally paying off in the real world. Aboard the Aching Tooth, Fleet Commander Scarn Vale watched the tactical display with 4 unblinking eyes, as gold and green light, the sensor signatures of what his systems were now identifying as human warships, bloomed across a dozen points on the crater map. His scanning officer, Reth, made a small, choked sound beside him. "Commander," Reth said, his rasping voice barely above a whisper, "that is not a defense force. That is a battle fleet." "I can see that," Scarn said quietly. Around them, alarms began sounding across the Vothrak fleet, 200 ships scrambling to break their patient, scattered formation, and form into something resembling combat order. But 200 ships spread across dozens of separate landing sites, each one anchored deep into a different crater to conduct its own patient scans and probes, could not simply snap into a unified battle line in a matter of seconds. The Vothrak had come to Earth's moon, expecting an easy landing, an easy harvest, a world too primitive to resist. They had not come prepared for war. That unpreparedness would cost them dearly in the next 10 minutes. Admiral Okafor stood on the bridge of the Endeavour, the great ship shuddering gently as it accelerated away from the crater that had been its home for 19 years. Around him, officers called out readings in calm, clipped voices, the discipline of a lifetime of training holding steady, even as every one of them understood, in the deepest part of themselves, that everything that happened in the next few minutes would decide whether humanity had a future at all. Enemy formation is fractured, Colonel Bello reported from the tactical station, her eyes fixed on the glowing display. They weren't ready for this. Their ships are scattered across at least 40 separate landing zones. They're going to take time to consolidate. Then we don't give them time, Okafor said. Target the nearest cluster, full weapons free the moment we're in range. The Endeavour's main batteries, powered by a reactor core that had taken engineers 11 years to perfect, began to charge with a deep hum that Talia Reyes, watching from the engineering deck below, felt in her bones, like the beating of some vast mechanical heart. She had built this ship to defend her planet. She had never truly expected to see it fire its weapons in anger. Now, as the charge indicators climbed toward maximum, she found herself gripping the edge of her console so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Weapons at full charge," she called up to the bridge. "Fire," Okafor said. The Endeavour's main cannon released a beam of concentrated energy that split the black sky like a spear of white lightning, streaking across the gap between the human fleet and the nearest cluster of Vothrak ships in less than a second. It struck the lead vessel of the Vothrak formation squarely amidships, and for one terrible, beautiful moment, the alien ship's hull glowed white-hot before it split apart in silent, expanding fire, a bloom of light and debris against the black backdrop of space. On the bridge of the Aching Tooth, Scarn Vale watched one of his cruisers die, in less than a second, torn apart by a single shot from a weapon his sensors had not even fully finished analyzing. "All ships," he snarled. "Return fire. Full offensive. Now." The Vothrak fleet, scattered but far from helpless, began to answer. Beams of crimson energy lashed out from a dozen ships toward the emerging human fleet, and the void between the moon's surface and open space filled with light and fire, as two forces that had never met before, finally, truly, began to fight. The Vigilant took the first hit, a crimson beam slicing across its outer hull and venting atmosphere in a silver cloud of frozen crystals before its automated systems sealed the breach. Its crew, trained for exactly this moment, did not panic. Damage control teams moved through the ship with practiced calm, and within 30 seconds, the vessel's weapons were answering back, its own cannon punching a hole clean through the hull of the Vothrak cruiser that had struck it. Human fighters swarmed around the larger battleships like schools of fish protecting a whale, their small, quick engines allowing them to dodge the slower, heavier fire of the Vothrak capital ships, while their own weapons chipped away at shields and sensor arrays. It was not an easy battle. The Vothrak, for all their surprise, were not weak. Their ships were powerful, their weapons deadly, their crews experienced from 40 conquests across dozens of worlds. But experience against a primitive world with crude explosives and slow rockets was very different from experience against a fleet built, in secret, for exactly this purpose, by the combined genius of every nation on Earth, working in silence for 60 years. "Fighter Squadron 7 has enemy contact," a voice crackled over the Endeavour's comm system. "Multiple hostiles converging on our position, requesting." The transmission cut off in a burst of static. Okafor's jaw tightened, but he did not allow himself to hesitate. "Bello, redirect the Resolute to cover Squadron 7. Endeavour, continue advancing on the primary cluster." "Aye, Admiral." The battle spread across the moon's cratered surface like a wildfire, dozens of separate engagements erupting, as scattered Vothrak forces tried desperately to regroup, while human ships, emerging crater by crater, pressed the advantage of surprise, as hard and as fast as they could. In the command cavern beneath Copernicus, still not fully evacuated, engineers and support staff watched the battle unfold on massive screens, some of them weeping, some of them cheering, all of them holding their breath, as the fate of their planet played out in fire and light above their heads. Marcus Webb, the old general who had begun this project 4 decades ago, stood at the back of the cavern with his hands folded behind him, watching the Endeavour, the very first ship he had ever helped design. Trade blows with an alien battleship twice its size. His eyes were wet, though he would never have admitted it to anyone in the room. 40 years, he murmured to no one in particular. 40 years, and here we are. Above him, the battle reached its first true turning point. Fleet Commander Scarn Vale, watching his scattered forces bleed ship after ship to the sudden, brutal counterattack, made a decision that would define the rest of the campaign. He would not throw his entire fleet into a chaotic, piecemeal battle against an enemy who had chosen the time and place of engagement. He gave the order to withdraw the outer formations, to consolidate his remaining ships into a single, disciplined battle line, and to fall back toward a defensible position on the far side of the moon, buying time to understand exactly what kind of enemy he was truly facing. "We are pulling back?" Reth asked, disbelief evident even through the translation systems. "We are regrouping," Scarn corrected sharply. "There is a difference, and any commander who does not understand it does not deserve to survive his next battle. We came here expecting primitives. We found warriors. I will not waste this fleet proving a point born of arrogance." The withdrawal was not clean. Human fighters harried the retreating Vothrak ships every step of the way, and 2 more alien cruisers were destroyed before the enemy fleet finally broke contact and streaked away toward the moon's far side, leaving behind a battlefield littered with debris. The twisted wreckage of 11 Vothrak vessels, along with the far more painful losses of 2 human fighter squadrons, and heavy damage to the Vigilant, whose crew fought through the night to keep her main reactor from a catastrophic failure. On the bridge of the Endeavour, as the last enemy contacts faded from the tactical display, Admiral Okafor allowed himself, for just a moment, to breathe. "Report," he said quietly. 11 confirmed enemy kills, Bello said, her voice hoarse but steady. "We lost the Vigilant's forward weapons array, but she'll survive. Fighter losses are higher than we hoped, Admiral. Squadron 7 took the worst of it." Okafor closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of every young pilot who had trained for years in simulators, never truly believing they would fly into real combat, and who now would never fly again. "Get me a full casualty report as soon as you can," he said, "and get me eyes on where that fleet retreated to. This isn't over, not even close." Far below, on the surface of the Earth, the battle above the moon had not gone unnoticed. Telescopes across the planet, from professional observatories to backyard hobbyists, had captured the sudden bloom of light and fire against the pale disk of the moon, and within minutes, footage was spreading across every screen on the planet. For the first time since the invasion began, the fear that had gripped humanity for 3 long days shifted, just slightly, into something else, something that had not existed in the human heart since the burning lines first fell from the sky. Hope. News anchors, their voices shaking with disbelief, tried to explain to a stunned world what they themselves did not yet understand. Ships. Human ships. Somehow, impossibly, human warships were fighting the alien invaders above the moon, and they were not just fighting, they were winning. In a small apartment in Nairobi, a mother held her 2 children close and watched the grainy footage on her television, tears streaming down her face, as she whispered a language of relief she had not allowed herself to speak in days. In a crowded subway station in Tokyo, strangers who would never normally speak to one another gathered around a single glowing phone screen, murmuring in hushed, hopeful voices. In Los Angeles, in the very shadow of the crater the Vothrak had carved into the earth just days before, people stood in the street and cheered at the night sky, not fully understanding what they were cheering for, only understanding that for the first time since this nightmare began, someone was fighting back. They did not know about the Deep Yard. They did not know about 60 years of secrecy, or the thousands of lives quietly given to a project most of the world would never learn the full truth of. All they knew was that the sky, which had felt like a ceiling of doom for 3 terrible days, suddenly felt a little less certain to fall. Above them, in the dark and the cold, the true war had only just begun. Fleet Commander Scarn Vale, retreating to the moon's far side with the bruised remains of his once proud invasion force, sent an urgent, encrypted transmission back toward Vothrak space, requesting reinforcements, requesting answers, requesting to know how a world his scouts had classified as primitive had somehow built a fleet capable of bleeding 11 of his warships in a single, brutal engagement. The answer, when it finally came days later, would change everything. But for now, in the silence of the moon's far side, Scarn Vale stared at the tactical map, at the golden shipyard markers scattered across a dozen craters he had once dismissed as insignificant, and felt, for the second time in his long and violent career, the cold, unfamiliar grip of doubt. Humanity, it seemed, had been hiding far more than anyone, human or alien, had ever imagined. 3 days after the first battle above Copernicus crater, the Vothrak reinforcements arrived. They came out of the dark in far greater numbers than the original invasion fleet, 350 ships pouring into the system like a flood breaking through a dam, answering Fleet Commander Scarn Vale's urgent call for aid. At the head of this new armada flew a ship larger than anything humanity had yet seen, a vessel so massive that its shadow alone could swallow a dozen Earth battleships whole. It was called the Endless Hunger, and aboard it traveled someone far more dangerous than Scarn Vale had ever been, Grand Marshal Threx Kalon, a Vothrak commander, whose name was spoken across 100 conquered worlds as a synonym for ruin. Threx Kalon did not believe in patience. He did not believe in caution. He believed in overwhelming force, applied without mercy, until every enemy either knelt or ceased to exist. When he received Scarn's reports of a hidden human fleet, of 11 Vothrak warships destroyed in a single engagement by an enemy previously dismissed as primitive, his response had been simple and cold. "Then we will not make the same mistake twice," he had said. "We will not probe, we will not scan, we will not wait to understand our enemy. We will simply bring enough ships that understanding no longer matters." Now, as his flagship settled into high orbit above the moon, Threx Kalon studied the tactical reports from the first battle, with a cruel, patient thoroughness that Scarn himself, humbled by his earlier defeat, found impossible to argue with. 26 ships, Threx said, his voice a deep, grinding rumble even through the ship's translation systems. 26 ships against our original 200, and they cost you 11 vessels and forced a full retreat. Impressive, for savages who build their homes out of glass and burn liquid rock for fuel. "They are not savages, Grand Marshal," Scarn said carefully. "Their technology in some areas exceeds our own understanding of material science. Their weapons killed 11 ships out of 200, Threx interrupted. I have 350 more. Mathematics, Commander Vale, has a way of solving problems that caution cannot." Deep beneath the moon's surface, in the command cavern that had become the beating heart of humanity's defense, Admiral Okafor received the sensor reports of the incoming Vothrak reinforcements, with a face carved from grim, quiet resolve. 350 ships. Combined with the survivors of the original invasion force, the enemy now commanded well over 500 vessels against humanity's 26, soon to be 30, as the last of the Deep Yard's hidden shipyards finished bringing their vessels online. "That's not a battle we can win by strength alone," Colonel Bello said quietly, studying the tactical projections. "Even with our technological advantages, the numbers are simply too far apart." "I know," Okafor said. "Which means we don't fight the battle they want us to fight." He turned to the wider assembly of fleet captains, engineers, and strategists gathered in the cavern, their faces lit by the glow of the great tactical sphere hovering above them. Marcus Webb stood near the back, his old eyes sharp despite his years, watching the young admiral he had personally recommended for this command decades earlier. "For 60 years, Okafor said, this project was never designed around the idea of matching the enemy ship for ship. We knew, from the very beginning, that whatever came for Earth would likely outnumber us. So we built for something else. We built for terrain. We built for knowledge of a battlefield no invader could ever fully map. And most of all, we built to make our enemy fight on our terms, in our home, surrounded by traps and defenses they could never anticipate." He gestured, and the tactical sphere shifted, zooming in on the moon's surface, highlighting dozens of small markers scattered across craters both familiar and obscure. Points that, to any outside observer, would have looked like nothing more than ordinary lunar terrain. "For decades," Okafor continued, alongside the shipyards themselves, the Deep Yard project also seeded the moon's surface with automated defense platforms, mass driver emplacements, minefields disguised as ordinary rock. Sensor arrays that can track a fly moving across the crater floor from 100 kilometers away. None of it was ever meant to fight a fleet in open space. All of it was meant to turn this moon into the single deadliest piece of territory in the solar system, for anyone foolish enough to fight a battle here instead of somewhere safer. Nasser, standing near the front with a tablet full of data from her ongoing analysis of the captured Vothrak probe, spoke up. "Admiral, if we can lure a significant portion of their fleet into the defended zones around Tycho and Copernicus, our automated systems alone could inflict serious damage before our ships even fire a shot." "Exactly," Okafor said. "We are not going to win this fight by being stronger than them. We are going to win it by making sure they never get to fight the battle they think they're fighting." The plan that emerged over the following hours was simple in concept, though brutally complex in execution. The Earth Defense Fleet would not meet the massive Vothrak armada in open space, where sheer numbers would eventually grind down even the most advanced human ships. Instead, the fleet would draw the enemy forces down toward the moon's surface, into the dense minefields and defense platforms surrounding the two largest shipyards, using the terrain itself as a weapon no Vothrak commander would think to respect, until it was already killing them. It was, Okafor knew, a desperate gamble. But desperate gambles, he had learned over a long career, were sometimes the only kind that worked against an enemy who believed too completely in their own overwhelming strength. Grand Marshal Threx Kalon, for his part, believed completely. "Full advance," he ordered, 2 days after his arrival, as his combined fleet of over 500 ships began moving toward the moon's surface, in a formation so vast, it seemed to blot out the stars themselves. No feints, no probes. We crush whatever hides beneath these craters, and we crush it completely. Scarnvale, watching the advance from his position aboard the Aching Tooth, felt the same cold unease he had felt during the first battle, though he said nothing further. Threx Kalon did not want caution. Threx Kalon wanted results, and results, in the Grand Marshal's mind, came from strength, not subtlety. Aboard the Endeavour, Admiral Okafor watched the enemy fleet's approach on the tactical display, his expression unreadable as 500 ships descended toward the moon, like a storm breaking over open water. "They're not being careful," Bello observed. "They're coming straight down the middle." "Good," Okafor said quietly. "Let them." The Earth Defense Fleet pulled back, ship by ship, appearing to retreat toward the shipyards at Tycho and Copernicus, in a maneuver that, to Vothrak sensors, looked exactly like fear. Threx Kalon, watching the retreat from his flagship, allowed himself a rare, cruel smile. "You see, Commander Vale," he said, "savages who found a few clever weapons still panic when faced with true strength. Advance the full fleet. Do not let them regroup in their hiding holes." The Vothrak armada surged forward, hundreds of ships pouring down toward the lunar surface, in pursuit of the retreating human fleet, exactly as Okafor had hoped they would. They did not see the minefields until the first ships began to die. It started subtly, a single scout vessel at the edge of the formation, simply vanishing in a silent flash of light, then another, then a cluster of 6 ships near the formation's leading edge, erupting almost simultaneously, as they passed through a field of disguised explosive charges, buried decades ago in the loose lunar regolith, charges built to look, to every scanning system the Vothrak possessed, like nothing more than ordinary rock and dust. "Report," Threx Kalon bellowed, his cruel smile vanishing in an instant. "Mines, Grand Marshal," came the frantic reply. "The entire approach corridor is seeded with explosive devices, camouflaged beyond our detection range. We are losing ships faster than we can identify the pattern of the field." Then the mass drivers opened fire. Buried deep within the crater walls surrounding Tycho and Copernicus, automated defense platforms that had sat dormant for decades came roaring to life, firing solid projectiles accelerated to devastating speeds by magnetic rails powered by reactors that had been quietly humming beneath the lunar surface since before most of the Vothrak fleet's crew had even been born. These were not elegant weapons, they were not beams of energy or clever alien technology. They were simply mass, moving impossibly fast, and against them, even the thickest Vothrak shielding proved to be little more than an inconvenience. The Vothrak fleet, which had entered the moon's gravity well in a confident, overwhelming formation, found itself suddenly caught in a killing field of mines, mass drivers, and disguised sensor traps, all of it triggering at once, in a coordinated barrage that had been planned, refined, and rehearsed for decades, in simulations no one outside the deep yard had ever witnessed. And into that chaos, the Earth Defense Fleet turned to fight. "All ships, engage," Okafor ordered, and the Endeavour spun in place with a grace that belied its massive size, its main cannon already charging as it brought its weapons to bear on the nearest cluster of confused, disoriented Vothrak vessels. The battle that followed was unlike anything either species had fought before. Human ships moved through terrain they knew intimately, weaving between minefields their own crews had helped design and rehearsed navigating 1,000 times in simulation, while Vothrak vessels, caught completely off guard, struggled simply to survive the environment itself before they could even begin to fight back effectively. Fighter squadrons darted between the wreckage of dying capital ships, picking off smaller Vothrak vessels with practiced precision, while the automated defense platforms continued their relentless mechanical barrage, indifferent to the chaos and slaughter unfolding around them. Grand Marshal Threx Kalon, watching his once overwhelming fleet bleed ships by the dozens within the first 10 minutes of true engagement, felt something he had not felt in centuries of conquest, the cold, sudden understanding that he had walked his forces directly into a trap of unimaginable scale. "Pull back," he roared. "All ships, immediate withdrawal from the crater approach corridors. Now." Tar. But retreat, in the tangled, mine-strewn chaos of the battlefield, was almost as dangerous as advance. Ships attempting to reverse course collided with the wreckage of their fallen comrades, triggered additional mines in their panic to escape, and found themselves exposed to human fighter squadrons hunting them through the debris field like wolves among scattered wounded prey. By the time the surviving Vothrak forces finally managed to claw their way back to open space, beyond the reach of the moon's defenses, the cost had been staggering. 63 Vothrak warships destroyed, dozens more critically damaged, their crews fighting desperate battles against fires and hull breaches even as they fled. Grand Marshal Threx Kalon, who had entered this system believing that mathematics alone would solve any problem caution could not, now stared at a tactical display showing the wreckage of over 60 ships scattered across the moon's cratered surface, and understood, for the first time, that he had grossly, catastrophically underestimated the enemy he now faced. Aboard the Endeavour, Admiral Okafor watched the enemy fleet retreat into the darkness of open space, his own losses far lighter than he had dared to hope. 3 ships damaged, none destroyed, and a handful of fighter squadrons lost in the chaos of the battle's opening moments. "They're pulling back to regroup," Bello reported, her voice carrying a note of cautious, hard-won relief. "Full withdrawal, Admiral. We hold the field." Okafor allowed himself a slow, tired breath, watching the wreckage of over 60 enemy ships drift silently among the craters that had, for 60 years, hidden the secret that had just saved humanity's world. "We hold the field," he repeated quietly. "But this isn't over, Colonel. Not by a long way. They came here believing they could not lose. Now they know they can. That makes them more dangerous, not less." Far below, on the surface of the Earth, the second battle above the moon spread across every screen on the planet within minutes, and this time, the reaction was not merely hope, but something closer to disbelieving, overwhelming joy. Crowds gathered in city squares from Buenos Aires to Berlin, watching footage of the wreckage-strewn battlefield with a kind of awe that no human generation had ever experienced before. For the first time in recorded history, humanity had faced an enemy from beyond its own sky, and had not simply survived, but had won. They still did not know the full truth of the Deep Yard, of 60 years of secrecy and sacrifice hidden beneath the very moon that had just become the graveyard of an alien armada. That truth would come later, in halting, careful announcements from governments still struggling to explain the unexplainable, to a public reeling from the strangest week in human history. For now, the people of Earth simply looked up at their moon, scarred, burned, and littered with the wreckage of an invasion force that had come expecting an easy conquest, and understood, deep in their hearts, that something had changed forever. Above them, in the cold dark beyond the battlefield, Grand Marshal Threx Kalon stared at the wreckage of his shattered pride and began, with grim, furious determination, to plan for a war he now understood would not be won easily, or perhaps at all. In the week that followed the Battle of the Minefields, the governments of Earth finally told their people the truth. It was not done all at once. and it was not done gracefully. Leaders who had spent their entire careers speaking in careful, measured words found themselves standing before cameras trying to explain 60 years of secrecy to a public that had every right to be furious, and in many places, the anger came exactly as expected. There were protests. There were investigations demanded. There were long, painful nights of argument in parliaments and congresses across the world, as people tried to reconcile their gratitude for the fleet that had saved their cities with their fury at having never been told it existed. But beneath the anger, something else grew as well, a strange, fierce pride. The Deep Yard had not been built by one nation alone, hoarding its secrets for its own advantage. It had been built by nearly every country on Earth, working together in silence for 60 years, sharing knowledge and sacrifice across borders that had, for most of human history, only ever divided people from one another. Old rivals had built ships side by side. Former enemies had trained crews together in caverns beneath the moon's surface, united by a threat none of them had truly expected to survive long enough to see. It was, in its own strange and secretive way, the largest cooperative achievement in human history. And slowly, as the initial shock faded, that truth began to matter more than the anger over the secrecy itself. Admiral James Okafor found himself, somewhat to his own discomfort, transformed almost overnight, from an anonymous officer in a project few had ever heard of, into one of the most recognized faces on the planet. He gave interviews with the same careful, measured honesty he had always shown his own officers, refusing to overstate the fleet's chances, refusing to promise a victory that was still far from guaranteed. "We won 2 battles," he told one interviewer, sitting in a small, plain office deep beneath Copernicus crater, the same cavern where he had once given the order to wake a sleeping fleet. "We have not won the war. The enemy that attacked us has resources we do not yet fully understand, and a homeworld we know almost nothing about. What we have proven is that Earth is not helpless. That is not the same thing as safe." He was right to be cautious. 3 weeks after the Battle of the Minefields, Grand Marshal Threx Kalon returned. This time, he did not come with overwhelming numbers alone. Humbled by his earlier defeat, he had spent the intervening weeks studying every fragment of data his surviving forces had gathered on human tactics, human technology, and the terrain of the moon itself. He brought with him engineers who had reworked his fleet's scanning systems to detect the disguised minefields that had cost him so dearly. He brought specialized boarding vessels, designed to overwhelm human ships at close range, where their superior weapons mattered less. And he brought something far more dangerous than raw numbers: patience, learned the hard way, through humiliation and loss. "We will not advance blindly into their traps again," he told his assembled commanders, including a still wary Scarn Vale, who had earned a grudging measure of respect from the Grand Marshal after their first, disastrous encounter with this stubborn, resourceful enemy. "We will advance slowly. We will clear their minefields with dedicated sweeper vessels before committing the main fleet. We will target their shipyards directly, forcing them to defend fixed positions rather than allowing them to choose the terms of engagement as they did before." It was, Scarn Vale privately admitted to himself, a far better plan than the reckless charge that had cost them so many ships weeks earlier. And it worried him more than any previous Vothrak strategy had, because for the first time, his people were finally learning to respect an enemy they had once dismissed entirely. Aboard the Endeavour, Admiral Okafor received the reports of the approaching Vothrak fleet, now numbering just under 450 ships, still recovering from their earlier losses but far better prepared than before, with the grim understanding that the easy victories of the earlier battles would not repeat themselves. "They've adapted," Bello reported, studying the incoming sensor data with a tight, focused frown. "Sweeper vessels leading their formation, clearing mines as they advance. They're not falling for the same trap twice." "Then we don't offer them the same trap," Okafor said. "We offer them a new one." Over the following days, as the Vothrak fleet advanced with slow, methodical caution toward the moon, the Earth Defense Fleet prepared a defense built not around minefields and disguised terrain, but around something the Vothrak still did not fully understand: the sheer scale of human-industrial cooperation, now operating fully out in the open for the first time in 60 years. Shipyards that had once been forced to hide their work in secret now operated at full capacity, watched by engineers and workers who no longer needed to pretend they were doing anything else. 6 new vessels, larger and more advanced than any of the original 26, joined the fleet in the weeks before the third battle, built with techniques and materials the original Deep Yard engineers had refined during decades of patient, secret research. More importantly, humanity was no longer fighting alone, in ignorance of its own strength. Every data point gathered from the 2 previous battles, every fragment of captured Vothrak technology, every lesson learned in the chaos of combat, had been shared openly across the entire fleet, studied and refined by scientists and engineers who no longer worked in isolated, secretive silos, but as a single, unified defense effort, supported by the full resources of a planet, finally united by a common, undeniable threat. The third battle, when it came, was the longest and most costly of the war. It raged for nearly 18 hours across the moon's scarred, battle-worn surface, a grinding, brutal engagement that tested every advantage either side possessed. The Vothrak sweeper vessels methodically cleared paths through the old minefields, allowing the main battle fleet to advance with far greater caution than before, while Grand Marshal Threx Kalon's boarding vessels attempted, again and again, to close the distance and overwhelm human ships in brutal, close-range combat, where numbers mattered more than technology. Admiral Okafor, commanding from the Endeavor's bridge, through hour after grueling hour of continuous combat, watched as the fleet he had spent his entire adult life preparing to command, fought with a desperate, disciplined courage that made even the oldest veterans in the cavern below weep with pride. Ships were lost. The Resolute, badly damaged in the opening hours, was finally destroyed when a Vothrak boarding vessel breached her hull and detonated explosives deep within her reactor core, taking most of her crew with her, in a final, defiant stand that bought precious minutes for the ships around her to regroup. But for every human ship lost, the Vothrak paid a price far heavier still. Threx Kalon's forces, still fighting an enemy whose full capabilities they had underestimated, even after 2 humiliating defeats, found themselves ground down, hour after hour, by a defense that had grown smarter, faster, and more coordinated with every passing battle. In the final hours of the engagement, as the Vothrak fleet's losses climbed past 200 ships and Grand Marshal Threx Kalon finally, grimly, ordered a full withdrawal from the system, Admiral Okafor stood on the Endeavor's bridge, exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced, and watched the last enemy ships retreat into the darkness beyond the moon. "They're leaving," Bello said quietly, her voice hoarse from 18 hours of continuous command. "Full retreat, Admiral. All confirmed contacts withdrawing from the system." Okafor closed his eyes for a long moment, thinking of every name on the growing list of the fallen, every family across the world who would soon learn that their son or daughter, their parent or friend, had given everything in the defense of a planet that had never even known they existed until this terrible, extraordinary week. "Confirm the withdrawal," he finally said, "and get me casualty reports. All of them. Every name." The Vothrak did not return. In the months that followed, human scientists and strategists would learn, through captured records and cautious, careful analysis of enemy communications, that Grand Marshal Threx Kalon had reported back to his superiors a stark and unwelcome truth. That the world called Earth was not the easy harvest the Vothrak Empire had expected, but a fortified, unified, and technologically formidable civilization that would cost far more to conquer than any reasonable calculation could justify. The invasion fleet, reduced to a shattered fraction of its original strength, was recalled, and in its place came something far stranger and, in its own way, far more hopeful. Cautious, distant contact. The first tentative steps towards something that might, eventually, become diplomacy rather than war. Earth did not fully trust this sudden change of heart, and rightly so. But for the first time since the burning lines had fallen from the sky, the immediate threat of annihilation had passed, and the people of Earth were left to grapple with the strange, overwhelming truth of what had happened to their world. 6 months after the third and final battle above the moon, Admiral James Okafor stood once more in the cavern beneath Copernicus crater, though the room looked very different now than it had on the day the Vothrak first appeared. The secrecy was gone. In its place stood something new, the beginnings of an openly acknowledged Earth Defense Command, staffed by officers and engineers from every nation on the planet, working together not in the shadows, but in the light, preparing humanity for whatever might come next from the vast and dangerous universe beyond their sky. Talia Reyes, no longer bound by decades of secrecy, stood beside the Endeavor's battle-scarred hull, now displayed as a memorial and a monument in a newly opened public gallery carved into the crater wall, where families of the fallen could come to see, with their own eyes, the ship their loved ones had given everything to build and defend. She ran her hand along a scorched section of the hull, remembering 19 years of quiet, patient work, and felt, for the first time since the invasion began, something close to peace. Marcus Webb, older now than he had ever expected to live to be, stood beside her, watching a new generation of engineers and cadets tour the cavern that had once been the most secret place on Earth. "You did it," Talia said quietly. 40 years ago, you believed this day might come, and you built for it anyway, even when everyone around you thought it was a waste of time and money. Webb smiled, a slow, tired, genuine smile. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "None of us did. That's the whole point, in the end. We were strongest when we stopped pretending we could face something like this by ourselves." Above them, far beyond the cavern's rocky ceiling, the moon continued its ancient, patient orbit around the Earth, its scarred and battle-worn surface a permanent reminder of the week the world had discovered it was not alone in the universe, and had discovered, too, that it was far stronger, far more resourceful, and far more united than anyone, on Earth or beyond it, had ever truly believed possible. The invasion was over. The war for Earth's survival was won. And far out among the stars, word of humanity's stubborn, unexpected strength had only just begun to spread.